So, as many of you already know, unfortunately, Professor Pöhlmann couldn't make it. He can't be here. Catherine Speyer will read his paper. And I just want to say a few words about Professor Pöhlmann, even if I don't think we need to introduce his scholarly figure because everybody knows him. I think he's the father of the grandfather of the discipline of ancient Greek music. He worked for many years at the University of Erlangen, and after his retirement, he became even more active in teaching activity all over Europe. He was one of the founding members of MOISA, of seminars, first in Corfu, then in Riva del Garda, now in Bressanone. He's really tireless in his scholarly production and enthusiastic activity. I only want to show you the two quite recently published book of his scientific production. He published best articles or most recent articles in these two volumes, and is mainly known for his collection of documents of ancient Greek music, which he was the first to publish musical fragments. He was the first of many things. So I said he was the grandfather of our discipline. So I now leave the floor to Catherine Speyer, who is a young student, passionate student, and she will read the Professor Pöhlmann paper. Thank you for the attention. Please, Catherine.
Good morning, everybody. Dear Professoressa Eleonora Rocconi, dear members of the Scientific Committee, many thanks for the kind invitation as one of the keynote speakers at the 14th conference of the MOISA about technology applied to ancient music. The paper which I am going to present is not a direct contribution to this topic, but a methodological and historical essay which tries to define tools and theories for modern technology and their origin in antiquity. The presuppositions for modern technology are the experiment, the measurement of its results, and their codification and mathematical formulas, and last but not least, the communication of the results to the scientific community in order to make repetition, rectification, or falsification of the experiment in question possible. Chapter 1. Inventors of the experimental method. The Pythagorean Nicomachos of Gerasa, 1st till 2nd century AD, is the first witness for a widespread legend. The sage Pythagoras, wondering if there might be an instrument helping the hearing, like the diabetes, the compass, visited a smithy, where he listened to the sound of 5 hammers, the weight of which corresponded to the ratios 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, and 8 to 9. With the exception of the last one, the dissonant whole tone, the other ratios sounded as pure consonances, the octave, 5th, and 4th. By extending strings of equal material and equal length by weights of the aforesaid ratios, Pythagoras found out that the strings, when plucked, emitted the same intervals. This legend is remarkable in 2 aspects. Firstly, it is physically impossible, as we shall see. The ratios, which Nicomachos mentions, are indeed the correct result of comparing the respective length of stringing chords, as you can easily test on a monochord, but not of the weights suspended to them. Therefore, Gaudentius, 3rd century AD, who tells the same story, ascribes the invention of the monochord, Jan 341, 12 to 25, to the sage Pythagoras also. The monochord, as its name betrays, has one chord extended over a resonant corpus, which could be divided by adjustable plugs in order to find ratios of intervals. The monochord was still unknown to Aristotle. Its scientific use is described by the mathematician Euclides, 3rd century BC, in his Sectio Canones, Jan 148 till 166. Secondly, the legend ascribed Pythagoras the invention of the experimental method, the conception of which must therefore have been existing in the later Pythagorean tradition, as our text betrays. Ei aradynatoi tercoe boetheiantina organicaen epinoesae pagian kai aparalogiston, hoian hemenopsis diatu diabetu kai diatu canonos ekaitis diopteras eche. If it were possible to find a firm and unrefutable instrumental help for the hearing, as the seeing has with the compass, the canon, and the diopter, in Jan 246, 1-4. Not without the help of God, Pythagoras finds the solution by passing a smithy. Parati chalcotypeion peripaton ectinos daimonios syntychias eb ecose rasteron. When passing a smithy, he listened to the smith by some happy chance of God. Jan 246, 5 and following. Of course, this edifying story about the sage Pythagoras was known to every amateur of ancient Greek music. Still, Giuseppe Zarlino, 1517 till 1590, in Le Istituzioni Armoniche, tells it, following Boetius and Macrobius without any criticism. Vincenzo Galilei, 1520 till 1591, the father of the famous astronomer and physicist Galileo Galilei, 1564 till 1642, became pupil of Zarlino in 1563. He was the first to question the physical correctness of the smithy legend. In his house in Florence, as the biographer of Galileo Galilei mentions, Vincenzo stretched several strings strung by different weights, following the details of the Nicomachos legend. This way, he found that the ratios known for the main intervals, fourth, 4-3, fifth, 3-4, octave, 2-1, and whole tone, 9-8, had to vary with the square root of the tension applied to strings, so that the weights suspended on strings of equal length had to be in the ratio of 9-4 in order to give the interval of a pure fifth, 3-2, and so on. Later, Vincenzo Galilei became famous as musician and leading member of the Florentine Camerata of Conte di Bardi and author of the Dialogo della musica antica e della moderna, 1581. His son, Galileo Galilei, 1564 till 1642, was acquainted with the musical experiments of his father. He received his first education in the Benedictine Abbey of Vallombroso, returned 1580 for the study of medicine in Pisa. After 4 years, he went to Florence in order to study mathematics, where he became known by the construction of a heterostatic balance, la bilancetta, in a manuscript, with which he, following the famous report of Archimedes about the crown of Hieron II, could determine the specific weight of gold or alloy of gold and silver. From 1589 till 1592, Galilei was professor for mathematics at the University of Pisa. As his biographer Vincenzo Viviani attests, Galileo observed a swinging chandelier in the Duomo of Pisa and noticed that the constant oscillation of it was only dependent of the length of the pendulum. A pendulum of 1 meter, exactly 0.994 meters, has an oscillation time of 1 second. This led Galilei in 1632 to the formulation of his law of the pendulum. The construction of exact clocks using a pendulum had to wait until 1657. Viviani's report about Galilei observing the laws of the free fall by experiments from the oblique tower of Pisa is not attested by independent witnesses and therefore classified as a legend. but his experiment with a sloping channel in order to determine the laws of acceleration is backed by Galilei's own report in 1609. Galilei, having chiseled a sloping channel into a wooden plank, covered it with parchment so that he could let roll down polished spheres of different weight and material. For measuring the time, Galilei had to use his pulse, or a water clock. By waiting, the water streamed out from a fine pipe during the time occupied by the rolling spheres. He received values he could compare. He found that every falling mass, independently from its material or weight, falls with the same constant acceleration, a factor which, in honor of Galilei, is abbreviated as g, that is 9.81 meters per square second. From 1592 to 1610, Galilei held a chair for mathematics in Padua. There he constructed and sold instruments like the compasso, in 1597 a calculation instrument, and improved in 1609 the telescope invented in 1608 by Jan Lippershey by increasing its enlargement to the factor of 33, which is one of the firsts he used for astronomical observations. He could follow these new interests more comfortably after his election to the mathematician in Florence at 1610, where he had no obligation to teach. His last years saw him on the side of Kepler and Copernicus, supporting the heliocentric system, which brought him into conflict with the Catholic Church. Eventually, he escaped the death by the Inquisition, but was confined to his villa in Arcetri until his death. With the experiments of Galileo Galilei, modern technology had found a new tool. This holds good also for acoustics. Marie Marsan, 1588 till 1648, determined in 1630 and 1636 by different experiments the speed of propagation of sound, which is exactly 342 meters per second, with agreeable results. In 1630, he measured the time which passes between the sight of the muzzle flash of a gun and the hearing of the shot, which gave him 448 meters per second. Another experiment in 1636, using the effects of echo, resulted in the value of 316 meters per second. And in 1635, the Democritian Pierre Gassendi proved by experiment that the speed of propagation of sound waves is independent of their frequency. He ordered a gun and a cannon to be fired in the same place and at the same moment, so that Gassendi, from a great distance, could observe first simultaneously the respective muzzle flashes, and hear some instants later the high and the low noise of the two shots simultaneously too. This way, Gassendi rectified a widespread error of ancient writers on acoustics from Archytas onwards, contending that the speed of the propagation of the sound varied with the respective high or low frequency of the sound. Chapter 2. Elementary notations of modern physical acoustics. Elementary notions. Galileo Galilei communicated his experiments and theories lavishly to a widespread network of scientists. This way, a nucleus of theories about acoustics developed. It might be appropriate to outline its elementary notions before turning to ancient Greek acoustics. The generation of sound. Sound is generated by an impact on a medium like air, water, or solids. This impact moves the molecules, which surround the place of the impact, moving themselves, the neighboring molecules, and so on. This way, the original impulse is propagated in all directions through the medium, until it fades, having spent its initial energy. The medium itself remains in its place, but of course, such an impulse is propagated in the medium in 3 dimensions. This means spherically. If there is not only one impact, but a periodical series of impacts, as produced by the vocal cord of the larynx or the swinging string of an instrument, the medium is vibrating periodically as long as the source is delivering impacts. Frequency and volume of sound. The frequency of periodic vibrations of the medium in the unity of time, the second, is counted in Hertz, in memory of the physicist Heinrich Rudolf Hertz from 1857 till 94. Vibrations in the air from 20 to 20,000 Hertz are heard by the human ear of a young person. Dogs are able to hear much higher sounds. If sounds are produced by a tuning fork, are visualized by an electronic device, the oscillograph, the result is a sine curve. The sine curve is the image of a sound wave. The physicist G.S. Ohm, 1787 till 1854, proved that vibrations producing a sine curve are heard as pure tones, the so-called sine tones. The volume of sound depends on the energy of the original impact, which modifies the amplitude of the sine curve, the so-called amplitude. Speed of propagation of sound. The speed of propagation of sound waves is independent of their frequency. It depends only on the medium permeated by the vibrations and its temperature, as was proved by experiment. The speed of sound for air of 20 degrees Celsius amounts to 349 meters per second. For hydrogen of 20 degrees Celsius to 1,305 meters per second. For water of 20 degrees Celsius to 1,484.2 meters per second. For oak wood to 3,380 meters per second. Dividing the speed of propagation of sound in air, 349 meters per second, by the frequency of a given sound wave, the results of the length of the respective sine wave. In the case of a high sound of 20,000 Hertz, the highest frequency heard by human ears, the respective sound wave has a length of 1.745 centimeters. Higher sounds are first heard as a hissing noise before the hearing fades altogether. In the case of a deep sound of 20 Hertz, the respective sound wave has a length of 17.45 meters. If sounds are deeper than 18 Hertz, the equivalent of subcontra D, the human ear no more hears the continuous sound, but a sequence of periodic blows of compressed air, as you may easily verify by a 32-feet stop of a church organ, by touching the lowest key of the pedals. It is interesting that in human seeing there exists a similar limit. In the cinema, the projector must show more than 18 pictures per second in order to produce the illusion of moving. If the projector is running slower, you see a sequence of isolated pictures. The timbre of sound. Voices and instruments don't produce pure sine tones, but specific mixtures of harmonic overtones, which are superposed on a fundamental tone. Harmonic means that the frequencies of the components correspond to the proportions of rational numbers. The fact that the mixture of fundamentals and overtones, which produces the specific timbre of sound, can be decomposed into its elements, namely different harmonic sine tones, was first proved by the French mathematician J.B.J. Fourier in 1768 till 1830. and elaborated by the physician von Helmholtz, 1821 till 1894. If a mixture of sounds is composed by vibrations which are not harmonic, the result is not a sound but a noise. Harmonics and noises are the ingredients of language also. Harmonics are the elements of the vocals, the so-called phorements, while noises are the main source of the plosive and sibilant consonants. These facts can be visualized by the oscillograph and the sonograph. Chapter 3. The Presocratics and Kinetic Theories of Acoustics. As a rule, ancient science had to dispense with the tool of experiment. Instead, close observation of the phenomena was used. This way, questions and principles of acoustics were already seen by ancient physiology. There existed already in the 5th century BC kinetic theories of sound and its propagation, which explain sound by an impact plexus on the air. Alcmaeon of Croton, beginning of the 5th century BC, a physician who is credited with the first autopsy, VS 24A10, detected the auditory passage, but considered the middle ear an empty resonating cavity, which was stimulated to resonance by moved air outside, as in VS 24A5 and VS 24A6. According to Empedocles of Akragas, living 1495 till 435, who discovered the ossicles of the middle ear, VS 31A93. The auditory passage is working like a resonating bell. Cordon. Air moved by sound outside the ear stimulates the air in the middle ear to resonance, VS 31A86-9. The resonating air eventually moves the ossicles, VS 31A93. Anaxagoras of Klatzomene, living about 500 till 428, was able to explain the origin of sound much better than Alcmaeon and Empedocles, assuming a periodic recurrence of impacts by moving breath on stationary air outside the mouth. He says, voice arises if moved breath collides with resting air, which is transported by the periodic recurrence, hypostrophe, of the impact unto the ears. The same way arises the echo, cited from VS 59A106. For a correct understanding of this sentence, the keyword hypostrophe is crucial. The usual meaning of hypostrepho is come back, like in Homer Odyssey 8:301 or in Herodot 4:120. But Anaxagoras uses hypostrophe in the special sense of come back periodically, which we find also in Sophocles' Electra 725, denoting the periodical turnaround of the racing car in the hippodrome, or in Hippocrates, Articulation 50, Prognostics 22, and Epidemics 1.3, denoting periodically recurring fits of fever. The novel idea of periodically recurring impacts on air, hypostrophe tes plexios, might have been born by observing a vibrating string on the lyre. Anaxagoras already knew that the ear, because of its inertia, hears recurring impacts on the air as a continuous sound. In VS 59b21, he explains the general weakness of perception by an optical observation. If white color is trickled, katastagona, into black color, the eye is not able to perceive the minute alterations discretely, but sees a changing continuum. This explanation is resumed later by Heraclides, as will be discussed later. Another condition for the Anaxagorean hypostrophetes plexios is the recognition of air as substance, which was denied by Pythagoreans, like in Aristotle Physics 4.6.213b 23. But Anaxagoras found a proof, elenchios, which comes near to an experiment, but by heavily inflated wine skins. As these could not be compressed, he inferred that air was a substance. Aristotle, who shares this opinion, nevertheless rejected the method of proof. Aristotle Physics 4.6.213a 22 till 27 and 31. Archelaus, pupil of Anaxagoras and teacher of Socrates, might have come a step farther. Diogenes Laertius attributes to him a pregnant definition of sound in VS 60a1. Archelaus first explained the origin of sound by an impact on the air, aeros plexis. This makes Archelaus the first witness of the opinion that sound is an impact, which is wandering through the air, while the medium rests stationary. The pre-Socratics before him, Alcmaeon of Croton, Empedocles, and Anaxagoras, rather considered sound as air moved by an impact, aer peplegmenos. Still, Diogenes of Apollonia, at the end of the 5th century BC, a late epigone of Anaximenes, adopts this side in his opinions about sound and hearing. Sound is moved air, which stimulates the air in the inner ear, VS 64a21. This movement eventually affects the brain, VS 64a19 and 40. This controversy was handed down unto late antiquity. The formula sound is moved in the air is adopted by Galen, living 130 till 200. De uso partium 86664 as aeros plege. And it was known until Boethius, 480 till 524. In his De Institutione Musica 1.3, he writes, "Et circo definitur sonos percussio aeris indissoluta usque ad auditum." The opposite view, the formula sound is moved air, as in Galen de uso partium 86644 aer peplegmenos and Boethius de Institutione Musica 1.14 aer pulsus, makes the medium of sound, the air itself, wander from the origin of sound to the ear. Aristides Quintilianus, De Musica 1.4, page 5, 19-22 WI, living about 200 AD, summarizes both approaches quite aptly, preferring the formula aeros plege. As we have seen, the pre-Socratics, as a rule, had to dispense with the tool of the experiment. Instead, it was usual to prove theories by analogies, as Otto Regenbogen and Hans Diller have demonstrated. Empedocles used the harmonic simile in order to illustrate such analogies. VS 31b 23 compares the colors of a painter with the elements of which the world consists. VS 36a 86.9, as mentioned before, explains the hearing in the middle ear by the simile of a bell, cordon. The method of thinking in analogies was developed by Anaxagoras, who coined a pregnant formula for it. The invisible becomes intelligible in the phenomena. VS 59b 28. Opsis ton adelon ta phenomena. An insight well counted by Democritus in VS 68a 111. As we have seen, There is also one testimony of the method of analogy for Anaxagoras, which explains the weakness of perception in general by an analogy from the area of optics, as mentioned before. This method of analogy was topic of the day in Athens, as we can see in the clouds of Aristophanes. As already Regenbogen and Diller have seen, Aristophanes ridicules in this comedy the Ionian physiologia by inadequate use of the Anaxagorean principle of opsiston adelon ta phenomena, as we shall see. Strepsiades, having entered the Frontisterion, learns first from a student of Socrates the new exact methods of the institute. An appropriate unit of measurement, the foot of a flea printed in wax, is used to measure the width of the leap of a flea, 143 till 153. Next, the student reports a theory of Socrates about the buzzing of mosquitoes, for which Strepsiades contributes an analogy, the simile of the trumpet, 160 till 165. Later, Socrates himself explains the thunder in 374 till 393 by the impact of a whirl, dinos, which forces the clouds full of water to collide, contributing himself a simile, the analogy of an overfilled stomach, with which Strepsiades sums up aptly. Thunder and farting are the same, verse 394. There follows an explanation of lightning. The clouds burst because of the heat of friction, if they are blown up by a dry wind, 403 till 407. This time, Strepsiades contributes the simile, the analogy of a bursting fried sausage, which Aristophanes has borrowed from Homer. These examples from the clouds, first staged in 423, make it evident that the method of the pre-Socratics, who searched illustrations for theories by analogies, the Anaxagorean principle opsiston adelon ta phenomena, was so familiar in Athens that the comedy could use it for jokes, which were understood by everybody. It is therefore legitimate to ask if examples of such Anaxagorean similes, which are attested later, should be allocated in the scientific context of the late 5th century BC. A splendid example is the simile for sound waves in the air, namely the concentric waves in water produced by a stone thrown into a pond. This notion is first attested by Chrysippus between 281 to 77 and 208 to 4. Chrysippus teaches that we hear if the air between the source of sound and the hearer after an impact, pleitomeno, begins to oscillate spherically, spheroidos, until it hits the ear, like water in a cistern after an impact by a stone thrown into it oscillates cyclically. SVF 2, 872. The same notion is attested for the Stoa generally. The Stoics teach that the air does not consist of small particles, therausmata, but is a continuum without any empty space between. If the air receives an impact by compressed air, pneuma, it oscillates spherically until the end, until it has filled the surrounding air. The same happens if a stone is thrown into a pond, where the oscillation is cyclical, while in the air it is spherical. Cited from SVF 2425. Because of the suggestive image, the theory of the sound wave became notorious. We can find it again in Vitruvius in the late 1st century BC, who explains the excellent acoustics of Greek theatres by it. Also, Heron of Alexandria, 1st century AD, is familiar with it. The physician Galen, 130 till 200 AD, considers the theory of the sound waves as generally accepted. Quoting Nicomachus of Gerasa, about 100 AD, also Boetius, 480 till 524, explains the ways of hearing by the theory of sound waves. But the qualification that the analogy of water waves for sound waves is used by the Stoics, SVF 2, 425, as arguments against the corpuscular theory, Trausmata, of Democritus, as will be discussed later, might encourage to search the origins of this simile in the 5th and not in the 3rd century BC. Chapter 4. The Atomists and Corpuscular Theory of Acoustics. The atomistic approach considers sound as a purely corporeal phenomenon. Its first representative is Democritus, 460 till 380 or 70, who asserts a constant emanation from all things, VS 68a, 135-45. Therefore, Democritus maintains too that sound was corporeal, VS 68a, 127. Sound consists of compressed air, as in VS 68a, 135-45. It enters with force every cavity, mainly the ears, producing movement, VS 68a, 135-40-42. This way, Democritus comes close to the opinion of some pre-Socratics, as mentioned before, who explained sound as moved air, aer peplekmenos. The propagation of sounds entails the subdivision of the air into small particles, trausmata, corresponding to the particles of sound which roll forward together, VS 68a, 128. A similar conception appears in Epicurus and Lucretius, when they are discussing the way of propagation of the simulacra, for 239 till 255. It is known that Epicurus, living 341 till 270, in his physics was drawing heavily on Democritus, as we can see in Lucretius, De Rerum Natura 4, 523 till 614. As in Epicurus' theory of seeing, which asserts the propagation of eidola, simulacra, Lucretius 4, 45 following, material emanations which are detached from the surface of the object of vision and wander through the air to the eyes of the observer, the atomists maintained a similar materialistic conception in their theory of hearing, as Lucretius proclaims at the beginning of his chapter on hearing. We have to confess that voice and sound too have a corporeal nature, as they are able to make an impact on the senses. Indeed, Lucretius thought that words and sounds detached from the mouth of the speaker or from an instrument were wandering like the simulacra corporeally through the air until they reached the ear of the listener, with the difference that the simulacra were moving along a straight line, while the sounds were able to follow a curved path, 595 till 614. Likewise, Epicurus considered sound a current, sent out by the source of sound, which was subdivided into particles of similar shape. Chapter 5. Archytas, Plato, and Aristotle on acoustics. In the late 5th century BC, the influence of late Pythagoreanism was felt in Athens. The Pythagorean Archytas of Tarentum, about 400 BC, wrote a treatise about harmonics, of which the beginning and important fragments are preserved in VS 47 B1-3. Archytas started with an extensive theory of sound, which was very influential. His starting point was the familiar kinetic approach. First, they considered that there can be no sound unless there has been an impact, plague, of things upon one another. VS 47 B1 and Barke 1989-40. When the sounds strike the ears, those that come swiftly and powerfully from their impacts appear high-pitched, while those that come slowly and weakly seem to be low-pitched. VS 47 B1 and Barke 989-41. Archytas tries to support this opinion about the speed of sound, which is, as we have seen, completely erroneous, by putting forward a series of observations, after which he confidently concludes, thus the fact that high-pitched notes move more quickly and low-pitched notes more slowly has become clear to us from many pieces of evidence. VS 49b1 and Barke 1989-42. In Plato's Timaios, in a sketch of the affections of the sense organs, there is a theory of hearing, which defines sound and hearing on the lines of Archytas. Sound is the result of an impact, plague, which is carried by the air through the ears unto the soul. Hearing is the movement caused by the impact. Timaios 67b 2-5. Swift movement produces high sound. Slow movement, low tones. Timaios 76b6. There follow two new distinctions, which are qualitative, not quantitative. Homogeneous movement produces even and smooth sound. The opposite produces rough sound. Powerful movement produces loud sound. The opposite, soft sound. Timaios 67 BC. Porphyry, in the second half of the 3rd century AD, pointing to the fact that plague itself may have an active, energeia, or a passive sense, pathos, attributes Plato, against his commentators, an understanding of plague in an active sense. This means that Plato makes the impact, plague, and not its medium, the air, travel to the ear. Like Plato, Aristotle treated music not as a self-contained subject, but dealt with its various aspects in different works. The most important discussion of sound, its origin and propagation, are found in De Anima and De Sensu. Aristotle derives sound from an impact, plague, of solids, steria, against solids, like Archytas, as mentioned before, or of solids against air, which implies movement in place, fora, and a medium, which carries the movement, mainly the air or water, as in Aristotle De Anima 420a, 19 following. It is of crucial importance for Aristotle's theory of sensation that the medium itself is not moved, but transports only the form of the sense object to the recipient. Aristotle De Anima 424 B17 following. Therefore, sound is not a body, but a movement in a bodily medium. Aristotle De Sensu 446 B25. This way, Aristotle rejects the atomistic view of wandering sound particles, which was wrongly imputed to Plato, as mentioned before, assuming instead a qualitative alteration of the medium of sensation. The air moved by an impact is subject to a modification, aloiosis, according to the peculiar nature of the respective impact. In order to explain the propagation of language, Aristotle uses the concept of shaping schematismos, the air which is breathed out by the mouth, according to the nature of the letters and syllables. This peculiar shape of the air is sometimes distorted during the propagation of language. This becomes evident also by the distortion, metaschematitestai, of the letters during the travel from speaker to listener. Aristotle, De Sensu 446, b 6-9. Alexander of Aphrodisias, when commenting the respective lines, helps to understand the conception of Aristotle better. The reason is that the shapes of the letters and the compounds of which the words, which were imprinted on the air by the primordial impact, are distorted, metaschematitestai, in the interval between speaker and listener, so that the sounds don't arrive at the ear with the same shape the speakers had given to them. Alexander in Aristotle, De Sensu 6, page 126, 10-19. The pseudo-Aristotelian problems consider the Aristotelian concept of shaping the air to be a general definition of sound. Why is it, given that voice is air that has been shaped and is in motion, that the shape is often broken up? Aristotle Problems 1123 and 51, and Barker 1989-90. And Theophrastus links the shaping of the air with the pitch of sound. If indeed the higher note does move to a greater distance, it is not because it is moved in accordance with more numbers, but because of its shape, schema. Theophrastus in Porphyry, page 64, Düring, and Barker 1989, 116. On principle, Aristotle adopts Archytas' misleading theory of the dependence of pitch on speed, but tries to extenuate it, starting with the original meaning of oxus, sharp, not high, and barus, heavy, not low. The sharp moved the perception to a great extent in a short time, while the heavy moves it to a small extent in a long time. It is not the case that the sharp is swift and the heavy slow. Rather, the movement of the former acquires its quality because of its speed, that of the latter because of its slowness. Aristotle De Anima 420 b 30-33 and Barker 1989, 78 following. Barker considers the possibility that the Greek way of perceiving pitch was different from ours. Thorniest problem arises when Aristotle in De Sensu 447a 12b 21 tries to explain which way concords can be heard. On the basis of the Archytian theory, the higher sound of a concord, for example the octave of a fundamental, must arrive earlier at the ear than the fundamental itself. In order to save the simultaneous perception of concords, Aristotle postulates that all concords are mixtures of two sounds, which are heard as one perception, not as two different ones. It is impossible, however, to perceive two things simultaneously with a single sense if they are not mixed. For a mixture purports to be one thing. Of one thing, there is one perception, and one perception is simultaneous with itself. Aristotle De Sensu 447 b 9-11 and Barker 1989, 75. As Barker has pointed out, this argument leaves unexplained the case of dissonances, for example the tritonos F with B, which do not blend but nevertheless are heard simultaneously. There was an explanation of this impasse, which is rejected by Aristotle. are people right or wrong about Concord when they say that the sounds do not arrive simultaneously but only seem to, and that this fact escapes us when the time involved is imperceptible? One could then say that this is why we seem to see and hear simultaneously, because the intervening times escape our notice. Aristotle, De Sensu 448a, 20-22, and Barker 1989, 76. We have met the theory of the weakness of the senses in hearing and seeing minimal differences already in Anaxagoras. But Aristotle, considering time a continuum without imperceptible moments, rejects this theory. Or is it not true, and is it impossible for there to be any imperceptible time, or one that escapes our notice, all times being capable of being perceived? Aristotle, De Sensu 448a, 24-26, and Barker 1989, 76. Chapter 6, Heraclides and Euclides. The Architian theory of origin and propagation of sound was the starting point also for a certain Heraclides in his Musicae Aesagogae, of which a long excerpt is quoted in Porphyry. The ascription of the text is controversial. The nucleus of Heraclides' theory of sound is the weakness of the senses in hearing and seeing during minimal moments of time, a problem which was already seen by Anaxagoras, as we discussed before. We have seen that Aristotle attacked this theory anonymously in De Sensu. Heraclides Ponticus was member of the Platonic Academy after 366 BC, and Aristotle since 367-66 BC. Therefore, his rival Heraclides, 390 till 310, is a good candidate for the Heraclides of Porphyry. Porphyry starts with the Pythagorean opinion that the differences of pitch are differences of quantity, not quality. Page 29, 27 till 33 Düring. As a further witness for this opinion, he quotes the Musicae Aesagogae of Heraclides, page 31 following Düring. Heraclides' contribution begins with a classification of possible movements, page 39 till 19 Düring. In the case of sound, he singles out as an axiom the rectilinear locomotion from the origin of sound, which is roused by an impact on the air, plage, to the ear, where the sound moves perception. In the next paragraph, page 39 till 19 till 26 Düring, Heraclides, trying to find the place of the impact, plage, in the course of time, postulates that the impact cuts the time like a borderline into a before and an after, itself having no duration, and illustrates this with the analogy of a line which divides a plane, itself occupying no space. But when the ear hears these impacts, it attributes to them, because of the weakness of hearing, an imperceptible duration of time. Page 30, 27 following Düring. A notion which is vigorously refuted by Aristotle. Heraclides illustrates on page 30, 28 till page 31, 7 Düring. He illustrates this paradox first with the simile of the spinning cone, an analogy from seeing. If a cone, marked with a white or black point or a right or black perpendicular line, is set in motion, the point appears as a circle, while the line covers the whole surface of the cone with its color. Heraclides' simile can be understood if one considers the point or the line on the cone to be without dimension in space. The simile of the cone is quoted from Nicomachos II by Boethius. At any rate, it is an apt demonstration of the weakness of human sight, which again carries us back to the 5th century BC again. On the one hand, the spinning cone, a simile from the area of seeing, explains by analogy the weakness of the hearing of minimal differences according to the Anaxagorean principle opsis ton adelon ta phenomena. On the other hand, already Anaxagoras had explained the weakness of the human sight by a kindred simile, as mentioned before. Perhaps Heraclitus adopted the simile of the cone from the tradition of early Ionian empirism. But Heraclitus comes a step farther. He demonstrates the weakness of hearing by an oscillating string, which can be observed not only by ear, but simultaneously by sight. Page 31, 7 till 19, Düring. As long as the string is oscillating periodically from one to the other side, one can hear a sound. This must mean that the string, at every peak of its amplitude, makes an impact on the surrounding air, which in turn, in each case, delivers a sound to the ear of the listener. On page 30, 27, following Düring. If this is true, every oscillating string must emit not one sound, but a series of sounds. As the impacts have no duration in time, it follows that between the periodically emitted sounds, there must be silence, which does not move the ear. But because of the weakness of the ear, one hears, instead of the series of single sounds emitted by the swinging string, the illusion, fantasia, of a continuous sound. Page 31, 9 till 21, Düring. We have to admit that Heraclitus, perhaps following the notion of Anaxagoras of periodic impacts, hypostrophe plexios, on air, and the simile of Anaxagoras concerning weakness of sight and hearing, as discussed before, succeeded in finding a satisfying theory of sound, which is far superior to the theories of all his contemporaries. By thorough observation, he detected that there is a limit for continuous perception by seeing and hearing, which requires 18 impressions per second, as we know today. This theory was adopted and modified by the author of De Audibilibus, as we shall see. 8 centuries later, the theory of sound of Heraclitus reappears at Boëthius, 480 till 524, who quotes the lost Eisagogé of the musicologist Nicomachos of Gerasa from about 100 AD. The beginning of the quotation of Heraclitus in Porphyry, on page 39 to 19 Düring, has close affinities with the Prefatio of Sectio Canonis, 148, 5-6 Jan, as Barker has noticed. Its author, perhaps the mathematician Euclides of Alexandria, about 300 BC, was the first to develop a self-consistent theory of sound and pitch. Since all sounds occur when some impact occurs, and since it is impossible for an impact to occur unless movement has occurred beforehand, and since of movements some are closer packed, pyknoterai, others more widely spread, araioterai, those which are closer packed producing higher notes, and those which are more widely spaced, lower ones, it follows that some notes must be higher, since they are composed of closer packed and more numerous movements, and others lower, since they are composed of movements more widely spaced and less numerous. Sectio Canonis 148, 5 till 49, 3 Jan, and Barker 1989, 191 following. Like Anaxagoras and Heraclitus, Euclides explains sound by a series of periodically recurring movements and impacts. Instead of coupling high and low speed with high and low pitch, like Archytas, Euclides couples high and low frequencies of movements, araioterai or pycnoterai kinesis, with high and low pitch. This way, the problem of simultaneous hearing of concords and discords disappears. The fundamental A arrives as early as its overtones B, octave, C, fifth above octave, and D, double octave, at the ear of the listener. In principle, this was seen too by Aristotle's Problemata, 1939. Euclides was guided by the well-established fact that the ratios of the concords, for which he was going to develop a mathematical basis in his propositions, were either multiple or epimoric, Sectio Canonis 149, 17 till 24 Jan. Multiple, poloplasios, is a proportion following the formula m multiplied by n together divided by n. For example, 2 divided by 1, the proportion of the octave. Epimoric, epimorios, is a proportion following the formula n plus 1 together divided by n. For example, 3 divided by 2, the proportion of the fifth, or 9 divided by 8, the proportion of the tone, a dissonant interval. The numerical element behind the familiar proportions of concords and discords is the relative number of movements and impacts. The fact that concords and discords can be heard simultaneously obviously compelled Euclides to conclude that the faster movements causing higher sounds must be closer packed, pycnoterai, than the lower movements causing lower sounds, which are more widely spaced, araioterai, which implicates that all sounds travel from their origin to the ear of the listener with the same speed. Barker pointed to the astonishing fact that Euclides alone clearly articulates the view that frequency of impact is actually responsible for a note's perceived pitch. Conclusion. As we have seen, questions of acoustics were discussed by Greek philosophers according to the preconceptions of their respective schools. The mainstream was Platonic and peripatetic, with the strong tendency to explain effects of sound as qualities. A part of it was the Pythagorean tradition, which aimed to reduce everything to numbers. The atomists, the first of which was Democritus, developed a corpuscular theory of sound. Still earlier, a kinetic conception of sound was developed by Alcmaeon of Groton and Empedocles, with which the Ionian empirism could go together. With his maxim, opsis adelon ta phenomena, Anaxagoras of Klezomenae found the principle of empirism, which used, instead of the experiment, the reasoning about analogies as clue to the adela. Polemics of the ancient comedy attest that Ionian empirism was commonplace in 5th century BC Athens. A wave theory of sound, which is backed by analogies, similia, can be traced back unto Anaxagoras, which was furthered by Archelaus and mathematically consolidated by Euclides. The monochord eventually offered an instrument for experiments about this theory. Heraclides tried to incorporate the wave theory of sound into the peripatos also. The elements of it are transmitted until late antiquity and appear still in Boethius. But the Platonic and peripatetic mainstream overcame until the rebirth of ancient empirism in the experimental science of the Renaissance by Vincenzo and Galileo Galilei. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thanks, Professor Pöhlmann. I would like to call here MOISA President, Daniela Castaldo, MOISA former President, Angelo Meriani, and our dear colleague, Donatella Restani, because as many of you know, Professor Pöhlmann this year is celebrating his 90th birthday. So we thought to make him a present, a livre d'or, in which we collected some pictures of him, some messages from all MOISA members. And so even if he's not here, Catherine is going to bring it to him, and I wanted to show it to all of you, and also so it stays on YouTube. And so I think we should give a big hug and clap to Professor Pöhlmann.
Welcome to this third panel of our conference. After this very, very intensive keynote lecture, we can move now to the third panel, focusing on iconography and experimental archaeology. Our first speaker is Felipe Nascimento de Araujo. Sorry for the terrible pronunciation. Felipe Nascimento is a PhD candidate in history at the University of the State of Rio de Janeiro. And he also is member of the research team Núcleo de Estudios de Antiquidade in the same university, and currently is visiting scholar at the University of Strasbourg under the supervision of Sylvain Perrault. And Felipe Nascimento is interested in different topics concerning music iconography in ancient Greece. And today he is presenting a paper on the cultural memory of the ancient musical performance, an interdisciplinary dialogue through the iconography of Attic vase paintings. Please.
Thank you for the introduction, Professor Castaldo. So, I will talk one of my topics of my doctoral research that I'm developing now. So, a part of that I'm studying the new music on the 15th century on the Hellenic culture with the focus in the Attic localization. So, until this point in my doctoral research, I have cataloged 51 ceramics, 51 vases, depicting paintings of professional musicians to study the development of the new musical genres that would be the new music in the 15th century. It is crucial to highlight that I choose vase paintings that focus exclusively on musicians who perform the Aulos and Cithara, because I want to defend that these musicians have developed the new style, the new music, during the whole 15th century, not only in the end of the 15th century, not only in the late 15th century, but during all the centuries. It's not only the few decades phenomenon, in my view. So, in these professional musicians, they are highly specialized, very technical, very virtuoso. They're one of the few people that developed the new musical genres, the new music. So we specifically define professional musicians, people that are related to the musical competition, would be the musicoiagones, that was performance that was related to the civic festivals, that music working in the context of the theater and other events. As a result, we have identified five distinct categories of scenes featuring professional musicians in 51 vases. So these 5 parts will be the 5 categories, 5 plus 1. It would be the 6th century, the whole 6th century. This phase features elaborate clothing, elaborate vestment with the Oriental influence that was already present in vase paintings. possibly related to the professional musicians in this early period. In that case, I'm defending that we'd have this kind of performance not only in the procession context, in the religious causes, let's put them that way, but we have this kind of professional, high specialized performances, just not only in the procession, the religious context. So the second category is the early 15th century, that would be the solitary competitors and performances that are represent based directly on the reality, on the reference, with a few mythological scenes. The third phase would be the middle 15th century, that would be the musical performances, agonistic, mixed with the elements of mythical narrative. In that case, by mythical narrative, I'm saying that was mostly scenes with the winged Nikai, that Nikes on the singular, that would be the representation of the victory. But in that case, this category is, the main difference is the mythical elements, the fantastic elements, that I will explain further. The reason that I consider like two different phases. So the fourth phase would be the late 15th century musical performances and theatrical context, elements of mythical narrative, consolidation of foreign investments, garments, in musicians who are now represented as mythical characters. In that case, I didn't find a large number of the musical agonists at the end of the 15th century. I mean, I found the musical agonists with the analogy in the mythical scenes. Mostly the scenes depicting Orpheus and Thamyras most of the time. So it's a very, very mythical, let's say, mythical category, you know. And theatrical performances also. You have a lot of theatrical scenes and professional musicians in that scenes. And the other context, it would be the vases with the professional musicians that were identified by the clothing, garments, instruments, and posture, but with no relation to the other context. Actually, these vases was vases that I found very interesting by the clothing, they offer a complementary perspective to the other images. So an example would be the pronomos vase. That is a very complex scene with a lot of elements, but we have a representation, one image of pronomos that were in the garments of professional, that was a lot of foreign elements, not only the Greek one elements. And I found it interesting, but the pronomos vase, there is no in these four categories, and the only thing that is interesting in the pronomos vase is just the musician, so it's separate category. And today, as my main objective, I will focus specifically on the vase of the second category, that would be the early 15th century vases, depicting scenes of professional musicians, as I said earlier. So far, we have cataloged 16 vases on this category, because I want to do a very focused analysis, so that's why I don't have 100 vases or 200 vases. I want to focus on the few vases, on the, how can I say, on a very detailed analysis. That's why I will show you 3 vases, how I will analyze that. The methodology that I'm working consists in the analysis of the semiotic, image semiotic, that is based on the assumptions established by the French author Martin Joly, French author. Additionally, we propose the incorporation of other concepts such as soundscapes and their relation with the subject within the traditional analysis framework that we use on Brazil, on my research team on the world. But our aim is to address this, and I will adapt some kind of elements to adapt to iconographical analysis that is focused specifically in musical performances. So I will address some kind of concepts from the musical iconography, that is studies field that, an example is the French author Florence Guétreux, like the 2006 Histoire des instruments de représentation de la musique en France, the book of 2017, Devoir la musique, and the concept also of paisagens sonoras, soundscapes. Paisagens sonoras in Portuguese. Well, the 3 vases selected for this presentation cover the period between 500 and 470 BC, representing the first quarter of the 5th century. So this period followed the establishment of the establishment of isonomy and the Clisthenes reforms that led to the development of the democracy. And it's also during that period the oldest surviving theatrical work, Aeschylus Persians, Aeschylus, was created. So these artifacts, these 3 vases, along with the other images, provide evidence of a cultural memory regarding professional musician activities, musical activities that existed in that period. By professional, I'm saying again, we mean high-skilled musicians who are trained in their craft, although not in the modern sense of being salaried workers, because there is no kind of the modern concept of work in the classical Greece. There is no evidence, getting back to Moses' feeling, to the Jean-Pierre Vernant, there is no concept of work. But there's no evidence of cash prize in competitions or indications of professional organizations as in the Hellenistic period. And we can see in the second half of the 6th century, we were already seeing it, this kind of agonistic images that is very, very look-alike from the 5th century vase that I will show today. So images depicting musical competitions can be found as early as the second half of the 6th century BC. However, I argue that in addition to the advancement of red figure painting techniques, which allowed for more detailed performances, the cultural memories portray of these images signify the beginning of a developmental process that would span the entire 5th century. So this process culminated in the emergence of complex musical genres, later classified as the new music. In that case, I'm considering like an ensemble of the musical innovators, not only a united musical revolution, but several innovations. But yes, as the cultural memory, I'm saying that is my theoretical approaches following the definitions of Jan and Aleida Asmans that refers to the conscientious act to preserving the beliefs, concepts, ideas, and general knowledge of a particular social group or institution to prevent their disappearances. It's closely related to the concepts derived from the social-cultural studies, mostly. The maintenance and interpretation of that memory is assigned to a certain authority figure of a given society, like a priest, a shaman, an archivist, an history, or even an institution that is responsible to keeping the stability, the faithfulness, and the course of the group memory. So cultural memories can be expressed not only through the institutional text, but also through images. So we have a lot of possible interpretations, and yes, the images, they show also the symbolic signs of political memories, like we have some kind of examples of images, like a graffiti in the wall, slogans, propagandas, monuments, etc., etc. So this theoretical approach is crucial in interpreting and analyzing these cultural memories expressed by the Antiquity vase paintings, given the scarcity of textual documents regarding the life and daily activities of musicians during our selected period. So here we go to the ceramics. Oh, and by the way, one of the examples from this expression of the cultural memory is the will to remember the dead, like the memento mori and another representations that is very imagetic, is very symbolic, the memento mori, and all the sayings and all the kinds of little canções, little cantatas, I think that's in Italiano, that's like the Guy Fawkes, remember of 5th November. You have all this kind of inherent aspect of the memory that you want to get back the dead, you get back from the dead, you want to preserve, you want to, to do two things. You want to resurrect the dead, you want to bring back the dead, and you want to preserve what you don't want to be forgotten. So this would be the main anthropological aspect of the cultural memory. following the assumptions of Lyda Asman. So here we go to the ceramics. The first part of the analysis is just the catalographical data, the data of the catalog, like location, the number of inventory. It's very much like of the Beasley archive data, but with a couple of information, just like the social function. In the case of descriptions, I'm using the concept of anchoring of Martine Joly. This first vase didn't have an inscription, so he didn't have a inscription, so we don't have the anchoring, the theme. And this first vase, the referent that would be the reality, the situation, is the professional musician's performance in the front of an audience or a sole spectator of the side B. So here we understand that the notion of the paysage sonore, the soundscapes, following the description of Alexander Vincent, soundscapes are representations created by individuals or groups about their perception of sounds, événements sonores en French, that are constructed from a social historical process in which all the ensemble of the sounds are situated in the very specific historical context. In other words, in that case, the soundscapes is the social construction on the mentality. I mean, I'm not using mentality, but it's the cultural memory that determined society, social group, they produce a mental image about the sounds, about the paysage sonore, and they express on the painting, or even texts like the paper of the Dr. Sylvain Perrault in the 2015, Le Paysage Sonore, pour une archéologie de la paysage sonore, do paysage sonore, I don't remember the name, but yes. And we can try to reconstruct the paysage sonore through the images. So the desire for resemblance, for verisimilitude in the painting through iconic signs with the reference, is the musician in that case, is a typical in that specific case of this Louvre Museum amphora, 1005, is very typical on the iconography, because the gestural moments, the attire, the position in relation of the instrument, it corresponds to a highly accurate representation of a performance. I mean, it's not you don't have many mythical elements, you don't have a very fantastic element, so this is a very accurate representation of reality that I'm using reference. It's a very faithful. So the musician tight head, the first element, this is the musician tight head, just to above, correspond to the act of singing, but not only for the singing, but this kind of cultural image that could be idealized, could be not the reality, but if you want to express the volume, if you want to express a very high voice, high pitched or in high volume, you put the person look down with a mouth very, very open. And in that case, this would be an iconic sign. The iconic sign is the concept from the semiotics of image semiotics, and would be equivalent to the archaeology, archaeology of image from Philippe Bruneau. That is the scheme, that is the concept. The professor Fabio Vergara wrote several papers about it, about this kind of scheme, like it would be the iconic signs. So, at first glance, the musician appears very similar to the musical agonist depicted in other vases. However, the elements of iconic elements present certain peculiarities compared to the others. According to Anne Bellis, the main singularity of the Louvre vase is that the details of the face, is suggesting that may be a portrait that very fidel, with a lot of fidelity, which is extremely rare in the Egert figure pottery. Uncommon details in the musician's face, like the eye and the hair coloration, that you can see is not black, but is a suggestion that he may be blonde or red head. With the blue eyes, you have the eyes also represented like blue or green eyes. The other facial features indicate a man in his late 30 years or early 40s, slightly older than the usual images on the musical iconographies, that you have the young musicians to depict a kind of divinization, a kind of idealization of the victory. So the musician larger body side also suggests that the representation aims to be faithful rather than idealized, as we observe in the other solo performance images with the same iconic signs, where musicians are typically portrayed as young and idealized, almost divine. And as the man of the side B, the referent would be the reality, would be the act of attending a musical performance, represented an audience or just one person. So the function of this man carrying a staff, we have a couple of questions. He is a simple spectator, he's a judge, or he's a judge or authority figure. Is he the rhapsode reciting verses, rhapsodo, with the musical accompaniment? So as Alan Shapiro points out, the staff didn't have a fork shape like this one, divided in two parts in the upper end, which is characteristic of the sticks that would be used by judges and the rhapsodos also in the competitions and the trainers also. So the most likely hypothesis is that he would be a spectator who through his gestures shows himself to be moved by the performance present on his side. So by his gestures, we can see like an act of encouraging or an act of approval, right? And it should be emphasized that although that the ceramics, another important aspect is, although it is manufactured in the shape of a pseudo-Panathinaike amphora, is a Panathinaike amphora, we cannot classify as a Panathinaike amphora because it lacks some another prerequisites like inscriptions and that are absent from the ceramics. So yeah, we consider the man that carrying the staff on side B does not represent a judge or authority that allow us to classify the scene as a direct representation of a musicos agon. However, the plastic message inherent that the pseudo-Panathinaike amphora, in that case the plastic message would be the format of the vase. The format of the this plastic message attributes a meaning to the vase that intrinsically related to the professional performance of an older musician who was already a winner and were already competing in other contests. Furthermore, the fact that he's singing, it indicates that he is a Citharoidos, even if he's not necessarily in the competition. This vase, the context may be a kind of aging musician that he command the vase to remember of his times of presentation. I mean, the reference is not an actual performance, actual agon performance, but it's a performance to resemble the act of agon. So the another ceramic is the Metropolitan Museum 2245 of the painter. So it's the same referent, the professional musician performance in the front of audience or just a spectator. So in this image, similar to the Louvre amphora, the musician's head is inclined upwards. That is a convention, that is an iconic sign that we can see on the very basic Martini Joly kind of tabelle, kind of scheme, that we have the iconic signifiers that is the primary signification of the image. You have musical instrument, the significance, the musical instrument, Cithara, and the connotation is the relation that the iconic the iconic sign they have with the historical context. So the Cithara is a high complex instrument, closely associated with the specialized music execution. Vestments, that a cloak covering a long chiton, right on the side B, the clothing, the relation of the clothing with the social-cultural context, that would be the representation of a professional garments, and the facial hair, that is the bird, that is the historical significant connotation, that is the physical attribute to represent an adult man, opposing to the younger. So iconic sign is the head to the upwards, also is the iconic sign. So there's an important distinction of this vase in comparison with the Louvre amphora, that he's not singing because his mouth is closed, you know. Even that could be a representation. He is between the phrase. It's like a photo. You think in a photo and the person is singing, and you take the photo in the right moment when the people is. But it's hardly to say that is. Probably he's not singing because his mouth is closed. It's not even slightly open. Therefore, this vase hardly depicts a guitaroid scene. Could be a guitarist or just instrumental performances, you know. Some authors defend that could be the professor of music, teachers, but hardly is. It's mostly a guitarist, at least until this moment, today, 3rd in June, I consider it like a guitarist. So the social story context, vases containing solo performance by musicians accompanied by another male figure, distributed on the different sides of the ceramic, in that case the musician and the spectator or the judge, are relative common in the early years of the 15th century BC, being a theme that is explored by artists such as Berlin painter. And the painter, according to the Christian Survinot-Winwood, definitely the painter had a great knowledge of the work of the Berlin painter, possibly being his apprentice or having contact with his work through another means. M.C. Smith complements Survinot-Winwood's hypothesis by suggesting that the painter probably collaborated in some ways with the workshops of the Mannerist painters, supposedly founded by the painter of Maison painter. In this case, while we consider that similarity of themes could be due to the influence of one painter had to another, in that case, I argue that the iconic signs that are common between these two images is not only the influential of the art, of the style, but is the iconic signs of images that express meanings related to a cultural memory common on a group, in that case of the vase painters, of professional musicians performing solo. So in that case, it was fairly common, just in the end of the 16th century, beginning of the 15th century, is very common on the cultural memory, on the imaginary, on the population, the thinking. You already have the image of the professional musician singing, you know, it's already a common thing. So it was not only in the end of the 15th century that you have the very complex genres, that you have the virtuosos. In the beginning of the 15th century, you have this kind of thing. And there was a presentation yesterday that talked about that. That is the James conference that told about this kind of. You already have the complexity just right before the 4th century. So the man on the B side is just like the same contemplative aspect on the same of the Louvre amphora. The fact that he carries a staff similar to one of the Louvre indicates that he's not a judge also, although he displays characteristic traits of authority. However, the authority probably comes from the evaluation of the audience or third parties who are watching the musician performance, and this is not necessarily a scene that offers a precise sonic landscape of a musical organ also. So the slightly more advanced historical period, that is the 417 BC, compared to the previous ceramic, as well as the fact that the painter was a younger artist than the Berlin painter, indicates that even some years after the Greek-Persian Wars, 10 years, 5 years, symbolic elements of professional musician practice, musical practice, were still circulating, and they were often associated with the festival and competitions. We can observe we can observe that despite the formalization of musical activity only taking place effectively from the second half of 4th century, there already have a great number of the highly specialized musicians in this period. So I will speak very fast about the Emperor by Brigos painter. The main difference is that a young Chitoroides without bird, and his head tilt indicates the same iconic sign of being a Chitaroidia because he's singing. And this musician is wearing footwear is another difference. So yes, the main difference is that this vase is basically an idealization. It's not very closely related to the reference. This is a very idealized vase. And this vase have also the inscription "Ho Pais Kalos," the boy is beautiful. The boy is the best possible translations. That lead us to assume that among the three vases, this one differs the most from the reference, from the another vases. So, in other words, this musician represented this figure, if he existed, is most likely an individual similar that was depicted in other vases. In other words, he was an adduct like the other two, but this is an idealization of the victory. This is just imaginary kind of invented figure. So, concluding remarks, these ceramics, together with the rest of the catalog that refer to that period, were inserted in the world of great economic expansion that came mainly from the sea trade. Athens exported a large number from luxury goods like olive oil, terracotta pots, these vases, and after the Greek-Persian Wars, this economic power would increase definitely with the establishment of the Delian League. So certainly the cultural memories from those patrons, it was constructed partly to the attendance to the music contests of Panathinaia and other festivals. In other words, they are all the part of the audience, especially the Berlin painter who have a lot of other paintings depicting musical instruments, mostly the Cithara, his instrument of choice into paint. So the cultural memories from those painters was constructed partly to their attendance, I just told you about it, but I defend here that those memories was not constructed only by this individual act of watching performances, but these memories, these images, was produced by a social cultural constructions that are in the circulation collectively since the end of the 16th century, as the black figures ceramics show us. So we can identify how the soundscape were illustrated by the iconic signs, and we can see how this social and historical construction are showing us the professional activity. And yes, this will lead me to my hypothesis that the new music was not an event that came in the end of 15th century, but the new music was developed for all the 15th century, yes, since the beginning. So this is my bibliography and such texts, my reference. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Felipe Nascimento, for this paper where you try to interpret the iconographic convention at the light of the concept of cultural memories. Thank you, Felipe Nascimento, and yes. And now is our second speaker. I don't know if Fabio is connected, is online. Thank you. Yes, Fabio. Hi, Fabio. Yes. Yes. So a short presentation of Fabio Vergara, who is a professor at the Federal University of Pelotas in Brazil. He spent many years in some stays in the most important research centers in Europe, Athens, and he was a Humboldt Foundation Research Fellow, and he spent time as a visiting professor at the University of Heidelberg. He was chercheur invité à l'École Française in 2022, and is interested in different topics about the South Italian pottery iconography. And he wrote, of course, several papers, and in particular, among the last one, we can we can cite some studies on the squared or on the rectangular Cithara, and also some last studies on prenuptial rites in Apulian vases, movement, gestures, object, and location. And so, Fabio, please, you can start your paper. Thank you.
Thanks for the presentation, Daniela. Unfortunately, I couldn't be there with you this year, but I'm very happy to talk after Felipe, my conterráneo, who I first met when he was still an undergraduate student. I'm happy to see him now working there with Sylvain Perrault. So, he presented Ethic Iconography, and I will work with Apulian, Italiot iconography. Apulian pottery is one of the most important sources of musical iconography from 4th century BC. More than 1,000 vases, Apulian vases, depict musical instruments. The representation of musical instruments on Apulian vases, both in red figure vases and in Gnatian style, therefore, we pay close attention. This iconography is a very important source for the study of the changes that occurred in the musical culture during this century in regard to the morphology of the instruments and to the way and context in which they were used in daily life. The repercussions of the innovative tendencies from the 50th century BC through the first decades of the 4th century, in association with social and cultural changes in mainland Greece, as well as in the rest of the Greek and non-Greek Hellenized Mediterranean areas, stimulated important reformulations in lutherie. 4th century Apulian vase making includes a strong evidence of the two different directions followed in the reformulation of the Cithara. First, the so-called Hellenistic Cithara, with an elongated and narrower shape, and with many regional variations spread all over Mediterranean, becoming lighter and more manageable as an adaptation to its new uses by young boys and women. Second, a rectangular Cithara emerged as a regional phenomenon in southern Italy, mainly in Tarentum and the surrounding regional Apulian. In this context, the iconography of Apulian vases testifies for the first time to this new form of stringent instrument. At first sight, it appears to have a rectangular shape with straight and parallel arms and an approximately rectangular soundboard. Susanna Sarti states that it has a sound box that is quasi-quadrata. Sebastian Ahrens, followed by Cornelia Weber-Lehmann, used the denomination Rechteck-Cithara, considering seine rechteckige Front, its rectangular front. The Apulian context offers plenty of visual evidence of these instruments, above all in vase painting, but also in terracotta figurines, votive discs, and even in coins. On the other hand, notwithstanding its presence in figured monuments from other regions in southern Italy and Sicily, it is scarcely found outside Apulia and seems to have arrived in these areas thanks to contacts with Southeast. Outside Italy, it occurs only very rarely in works later than the first occurrence in Apulian, like this one. Okay, supported by the evidence of this archaeological data, researchers have studied musical instruments in Magna Graecia, have considered the instrument to be a local development of Cithara family. Nevertheless, they do not share the same conception of local. Martha Mas and Jane McIntosh Snyders view it as an Italiote instrument, thanks to its representation in iconography from throughout southern Italy and Sicily. Anna Maria Di Giulio, on the other hand, considers it essentially a Apulian development. Hans Lohmann was perhaps the first to point out the relationship of this instrument with Magna Graecia when he stated that die rechteckige Form der Lyra findet sich anscheinend nur in unteritalischen Vasenbildern. Lohmann exaggerates maybe, since a few examples from outside southern Italy have been found, as mentioned above, as this marble relief from Peloponnese that you see there. In a different direction, Vera Lehmann does not follow this interpretation, since she thinks that the rectangular form is a symbolic reference to the Orient and not properly a regional feature. Hence, she calls it neither Italiote nor an Apulian Cithara. Furthermore, she does not see in the depiction of the rectangular Cithara on Apulian vases a realistic portrayal or of a regional stringent instrument, but rather a symbol linked to the representation of Adonis. This interpretation was recently supported by Alexandra Kambitoglou. However, in many of the scenes identified as Adonis and Aphrodite by Kambitoglou, I see idealized love scenes involving mortals, either in this life or in the afterlife. Now, the rectangular Cithara, what are we talking about? Authors not specializing in music are often imprecise in naming stringent instruments in Apulian iconographical material. Regardless of the instrument's shape, such authors randomly designate instruments as harp, lyre, or cithara, and their players as harpists, lyre players, or citharedi, paying no attention to the form of the instrument that the painter has chosen to represent. Although portrayals of instruments in vase painting reveal variations in morphology, as well as inaccuracies and idealizations with respect to the real examples of such instruments, most of the vase painters had in mind that they were representing specific instruments, which corresponded to particular social uses and cultural symbolism in daily life and in the imaginary world. Therefore, I want to devote more attention to the so-called rectangular cithara, considering that the local development of this instrument in 4th century Apulian is expressed by change in its morphology and in the modality of its use. Thus, I will present a summary identification of this instrument and some observations concerning its morphological and musical characterization. One should highlight some important contributions to the study of the rectangular cithara, specifically since they are based on systematic analysis. The works of Anna Maria Di Giulio, Mas and McIntosh Snyder, and Sarti. Di Giulio has the merit of developing the first catalogue of figure monuments from Apulia representing musical instruments, especially from the region of ancient Mesapia. And this work was developed there, very well, in Cremona. Thus, her study is based on vases held in the museums of Brindisi, Tarentum, and Lecce. It is a limited sample, but a representative one because of its connection with local territory. She identifies the original contribution of Apulia to the development of this instrumental form. Mas and McIntosh Snyder, on the other hand, producing an exhaustive study of the stringent instruments of ancient Greece, were able to construct a very comprehensive vision of the development and geographical diffusion of the Cithara, for they studied material from different areas of the Greek world. They divided the Cithara of the late classical and early Hellenistic periods into two groups. First, the Hellenistic Cithara and the Italiote Cithara. The later, so Hellenistic Cithara and Italiote Cithara. The later is the name they gave to the rectangular cithara, based on the presence of this instrument in iconographical material not just from Apulia, but also from Campania and Sicily. Nevertheless, regarding the rectangular cithara, the Giulio, despite the more limited material analyzed, shows more perspicacy in pointing out the Apulian role in the development of this instrument. I arrived at a similar conclusion. By comparing the iconography of different stringent instruments in Apulian vase painting, one can see that the representation of the rectangular cithara worked as a netic sign for supporting original and hybrid Apulian Tarentine culture. After observing the richly detailed and sophisticated manner in which painters represented this instrument, I can even state that the rectangular cithara expressed a kind of regional pride, based on the evidence of a preliminary catalog composed of about 100 Apulian red figure and dignatia vases, and on the observations of other iconographical evidence, I propose to rename this instrument Apulian Cithara for the following reasons. First, the overwhelming majority of iconographical representations of the rectangular cithara come from Apulian material. Second, the earliest representation of this instrument occurred in Apulia, where the first depiction appears around 370-360 BC. Third, the chronological acme of the representation of this instrument from 270 to 300 coincides with the middle and late Apulian periods in red figure vase painting, with the apogee of Apulian and Tarentine civilization before its decline, which was driven by the progressive Roman domination of southeast Italy. Fourth, there is a strong identification of this instrument with the social and cultural context of Apulia. Fifth, last, the iconography of this instrument reveals a certain degree of morphological homogeneity in contrast to the clear heterogeneity of the contemporary Hellenistic cithara. I think that the designation Apulian cithara better expresses the instrument's singularity and historical trajectory than Italiote cithara. Through the observation of archaeological evidence, I can infer a chronology of the iconographical representation of the Apulian rectangular cithara. It appears first on Apulian red figure vases around 360, maybe a little bit before, during the years of Architas in Taranto, on the vases of Varese painter, the example on the left. Then it migrates a couple of years later to other Apulian iconographical subjects, initially to dignatia vases, as you see here in the center, the image, then to terracotta figurines as the two ones above. Later, it appears in Campania and Sicily, thanks to cultural and commercial exchanges between Tarentum and indigenous Apulian centers and other Greek and non-Greek Hellenized regions in southern Italy and Sicily. Tarentum was a city famous for its musical culture. This prestige indicated, for instance, by the presence in Athens of the tombstone of the Tarentine musician Nicocles, who had a unique reputation as Citharedus, and by the participation of the Citharedus Heraclitus of Tarentum in the banquet organized by Alexander the Great to celebrate the victory over Darius. Thus, this regional invention, the rectangular cithara as represented in figured monuments, became well known outside Italy. It was known in Athens as on an on a Lecan lead found recently in the area around the Acropolis, in the Peloponnese, as I have shown here, and in other regions, especially in areas with which Tarentum and Apulia had historical connections, like Macedonia, as can be seen in the representation of the Apulian Cithara played by a woman during a banquet in a painted frieze on a tomb near Thessaloniki from the early 3rd century. Let's go to morphological aspects. Maas and McIntosh Snyder offer what appears to be a more accuracy, broad and comprehensive definition of morphology. Cithara with parallel arms that do not curve out to the sides and straight-sided, often rectangular sound box. And it has a straight-sided, often rectangular sound box. I think that this definition, indicating that the arms are parallel, not always perfectly, but as a predominant trend, and that the arms are not curved at their sides, as they are in the case of the lyre, and that the lateral sides of the sound box are straight. These definitions, I think, accurately reflects the defining features of this instrument. This homogeneity prevails in spite of the variations one observes in these images. So, certain homogeneous patterns prevails. Let's see. I'll talk about 2 of them, but 4 of them here. The angle of the arms, the form of a lower and upper line designed drawn on the sound box of the body. Third, the relation between arms and body of the sound box. And fourth, the ornamentation of arms. Looking from the lateral side, the arms are sometimes straight, like you see here, sometimes have a concave inflection forward when the painter is putting it more in lateral. And when he wants to show it more from front side, it's more straight. Looking from the front side, the lower and upper edge of the sound box body are sometimes horizontally represented, like in this example here, but sometimes they have an inflection to the outside of the sound box in an oval shape, like you see here in the Valesio Cithara to the left, in a triangle shape, as you see here on the right. Third aspect, the relationship between the arms and body of the sound box. Sometimes arms and sound box are separated parts, as you see here on the left, with the arms going downward along the sound box lateral sides. In this case, they may even be made out of different materials, as is revealed by differences of colors, what we'll not analyze today. Sometimes the sound box and arms constitute a single body, as in the standard classical Cithara that you see here on the right. Fourth aspect, the ornamentation of the arms. Sometimes there is none, it's simple, like the Naples example here on the left. But sometimes there is there are original details, such as little points added, painted to wooden vertical arms, as you see here in this other Naples example on the right, or zero line sculpted or plastic elements around the arms, giving it an appearance similar to a Solomonic column or to certain kinds of horns. I will give more examples of this because I think this is a very important trait. So just to look these examples of how the painter tried to present this aspect of the arm. Some more to your eyes to get used to this visual information. Some ornaments on the arms seem to be a completely original feature of the construction of the Apulian Cithara, a response to the aesthetics of instrument making, similar to the circular geometrical and vegetal ornamentation of tympana membrane, or to the bird-shaped details on some harps and cithara seen elsewhere in Apulian vase painting. So a decorative impulse of Apulian literary or vase painters. Considering the morphological components, I conclude that there was a pattern in the construction of this instrument in Apulia. These standard accommodated variations on the aspects mentioned above, giving luthiers a certain degree of liberty to choose between different alternatives. Thus, it was also easier to meet the demand of the consumers. These were not professional virtuosi musicians, most of them, as were the Cithara players from the 16th and 15th century depicted in the vases that were shown here before by Felipe Nascimento. Now, they were amateur players living in Greek Tarentum or in Hellenized indigenous urban centers like Ruvo, like Canosa, who enjoyed playing and hearing the sounds of this instrument in their daily lives as a symbol of joy and love. The frequent presence of this instrument in courtship scenes in a domestic space is an iconographic representation of this connection with the love scene. So let's go to analyze the soundbox body, if it is properly a soundbox or a simple rectangular table. I will analyze this aspect and another one. I won't analyze all the one I pointed before. De Giulio asserts that the resonance body, of these citharas seems to constitute of a simple table, not a real and adequate concave box. This simple table, as a technical solution for the resonance body, was absent in mainland Greece, but known in Pharaonic and Near Eastern tradition, as attested by the well-preserved Egyptian asymmetrical layers found in the times of the New Kingdom. However, Sarti follows another interpretation. She states that while the front surface of the soundbox was flat, the back could be cambered, bombata, the word she used in Italian. Mas and McIntosh Snyder confirmed the same, describing the back of the soundbox as humped back with a rounded ridge running down the centers, in accordance with the tradition of the standard Cithara from the archaic and classical periods. Thus, assuming the arguments of Sarti and Mas and Snyder, the oval or triangular drawing indicated by the painters in the upper and lower edge of the soundbox would in fact be an attempt to include the perspective. The painters were trying to represent the tridimensional form of the cambered and humped back from the body as it would have been perceived when seen from the front side. An observation, Apulian painters tried much more than Attic painters to represent perspective. Thus, this means that every Apulian Cithara had such a soundbox. It's difficult to say. Some three-dimensional examples, such as the 3rd century BC Terracotta Figurine from Tarentum, where the back of the instrument is very clearly shown, has a flat table or a very narrow sounding board, in spite of a cambered soundbox combined with the structure of an independent body and arms. In my catalog of approximately 100 vases depicting the Apulian Cithara, the drawing on the available image indicate curved or pointed alteration of the lower or upper border of the box in more than 2/3 of the cases. I suppose that this shows the painter's efforts to represent perspective when such alterations are present. This means that he wants to represent the three-dimensional volume of the soundbox. However, it is important to observe that the painter draws it in two different ways. In about 1/3 of the cases, with this alteration, he shows an oval line, indicating a curved back. And in other 2/3, one sees a pointed angle in upper or lower edge or both, which thus seems to be a predominant form. I interpret this in the following way. On account of the attempt of the painters to represent the diversity of construction of Apulian Cithara concerning the three-dimensional soundbox shape, they provide evidence for the existence of at least two, but maybe three forms. The first is represented by the instruments with a soundbox with a cambered, humped, and convex, this one, and convex back, following the tradition of the standard Cithara and indicating its membership to the Cithara family. The second and the third forms are not always easily distinguished because the soundbox may be so narrow as to be confused with a flat table. The above-mentioned rectangular Cithara of the Eros from Tarentum suggests the existence of Apulian Citharas with a flat table or very narrow resonance board in spite of a pronounced curved soundbox. This corresponds to a little less than 1/3 of the identified representations of rectangular Citharas in my catalog. The same alternative occurs in the Tarantinian terracotta representing a muse playing Cithara, the one that I have shown. Sorry, I mean this here, where the examination of the back reveals also what the Giulio identifies as a simple table without any convexity. The bronze votive figure that you know from Athens, from the Antiquity shipwreck that you have here, dating from 3rd to 2nd century BC, provides later three-dimensional evidence that helps us to analyze the situation. It is actually an example of a Hellenistic Cithara, similar to the one on the Tarantinian terracotta mentioned above. It also shows the back of the box tending to be a flat table, regardless of having the pointed elevation in the upper border of the sounding box when one observes it from the front side. However, it is not a completely flat since it has a slight pointed elevation that you can clearly see here on the left, running across the central line of the back surface of the body from top to bottom. Thus, one is not exactly dealing with a flat surface, as on the asymmetrical layer from the 18th Egyptian dynasty, but with a very small convexity. Fortunately, in a few cases of the vase painters represented the rectangular Cithara from the back, providing the solution of this interpretation problem. In a vase from Brindisi, it's not this one, but it's okay here, the back of the soundbox apparently has a slight convexity, which is reinforced by a discrete curved line on the base, indicating a kind of semicircle. It is a cambered soundbox, but with a curved, with a mild curvature, sorry. Nothing like the strongly humped body of the standard Cithara. I come now to the assumption that luthiers had choices in respect to the forms of the soundbox. He might have chosen a simple flat table, which involved acoustic limitations determining a more intimate sound, Or he might have opted for a convex sound box containing a small hollow structure determined by a slight pointed or a cambered elevation in the back. However, this is nothing like the large cambered form of the standard Cithara adopted to professional performances in large concert halls. This interpretation has been confirmed by photos that you see here, held in New York, probably not observed by the authors who studied the subject before, since it is one of the only examples, or I would say the only, that clearly representing the instrument from the back. The image is comparable to an open book, as you see here on the left, on the right, an open book seen from behind. Through this representation, we are able to understand the kind of soundbox the painters wanted to indicate when they drew the pointed alteration of the lower or upper edge of the instrument soundbox depicted from the front side, the ones that look like a triangle. Okay, the acoustic of Apulian Cithara with an almost flat rectangular sounding table or with a discrete soundbox would have been more suited to domestic performances, probably producing a smooth sound oscillated between downy and hoarse, nasal and woolly, appropriate for the expression of intimate feelings. Scholars, so the last aspect, going to conclusion, relationship between body of the soundbox and arms. Scholars have recognized distinct features in rectangular Cithara. Mas and Snyder state that the arms often extended downward all along the sides of the soundbox according to a number of paintings. Here they describe what you see. Here in the design, for example, is the information of the arms going down to the bottom, from top to bottom. Di Giulio identifies a different model in a rectangular Cithara from Brindisi, in which cassa e bracci infatti sono tagliati in un solo blocco. In my catalog of about 100 vases, this situation that you see here occurs in fewer than 10% of the cases represented in Apulian Cithara. About 85%, and less than 10% of the cases where I cannot get to a conclusion. But in about 85%, show a clear separation between the body and the arms that you have seen before, in so much as the arms do not seem to play any role in the acoustic resonance, unlike the classical stand Cithara that is similar to this one, in which the arms and box constitute an integrated sounding body. In few examples, one can identify box and arms as a continuous structure. And furthermore, in all of these, the upper edge of the sounding box, like you see here, is drawn in an oval shape, suggesting a slightly cambered back. I suppose that the construction of Apulian Citharas with the arms either connected or separated from the body indicates that there were, in fact, two variants of the instrument, or two different instruments. One may deduce acoustic consequences. At least one can assert that the model with a unified body, as the one you see here, or here, in the tradition of the Cithara family, like the standard Cithara or like the Phragmites, it allows a stronger sounding projection, producing a louder sound, more suited to a presentation in public. Evidence for which I can see in the Cithara besides the theater mask represented in a Gnatian vase from Munich that you see here on the right. Thus, it's not a coincidence that these examples show the oval detail in the upper line of the soundbox, probably having a cambered back and therefore a larger empty space inside. This raises a question. Is the variation of the rectangular Cithara and intermediated from between the Hellenistic Cithara and the Apulian Cithara, the overwhelming predominance of the exemplars with a separation between the arms and the box, surpassing 55% in my sample of rectangular Citharas, indicates that this would have been the patterns of construction of the Apulian Cithara. However, the luthiers and consumers had the option of an alternative prototype, the model more similar to the Cithara and more suitable for public performances. Concluding, in my opinion, the separation between the arms and the box results in an instrument more closely related to the lyre family than to the Cithara family. Despite its sound box being made of wood and in the form of a box with a flat base, which morphology would place it among the Cithara, besides that, the arms-box relationship is inadequate for a Cithara, in which they are integrated into one only body. That is why I prefer to call it Apulian Cithara in the more general sense of the late classical and early Hellenistic organological inventions, rather than Apulian Cithara, which would lead to a misapprehension of the musical and social nature of this instrument. The spatial analysis of the use of Apulian Cithara reinforces this interpretation, showing that in daily life it occupies a place that was associated with the lyre and barbitos in Antiquity vase-painting tradition from 16th and 15th century, and even in early Apulian vases. Thanks.
Thank you, Fabio. Thank you. It was very, very detailed, this paper on the diffusion, origin, diffusion, and also the use of this rectangular Cithara. We can go on with our third speaker, Marco Sciascia. Marco Sciascia, a brief introduction. Marco Sciascia is an instrument maker and a performer, and he made some reproduction of most of the instruments kept in the most important museum around the world. He took part in the project EMAP, and through this project he reconstructed several instruments, among them the Aulos from Ur, the Aulos from Paestum, and so on. And he is also the director, the organizer of this workshop Euterpe, and he invented this Lyra kit. The Lyra kit is a kit allowing students to build by themselves the lyre and to perform and to practice with them. And now at the present is studying the wind instruments at the museum of the Egyptian Museum in Torino. So Marco, if you are ready, you can start.
Questo mio breve intervento vuole concentrarsi sui molteplici dubbi che spesso angosciano un costruttore di antiche e doppie ance, partendo dalla scelta delle essenze impiegate per la costruzione, proponendo un metodo di catalogazione attraverso moderne tecnologie e cercando risposte alle mie domande, soprattutto fra voi presenti, per una migliore interpretazione di ciò che ci ha lasciato scritto Teofrasto. La scelta della paglia, con le caratteristiche che corrispondono ai pochissimi frammenti conservati nei musei, rinvenuti insieme agli antichi oboe sepolti in Egitto, presenta difficoltà perché i cereali, domestici o selvatici odierni, differiscono notevolmente dai loro antenati. Il mio occhio si è fermato sulla vena selvatica e precisamente su due sottospecie, la vena orientalis e la vena fatua. Io al momento ho pensato di concentrare il mio tempo sulla vena fatua. Questa è una pianta, è originaria dell'Eurasia, ma è stata introdotta nella maggior parte delle altre regioni temperate del mondo. La colgo nel periodo della mietitura, nella seconda metà di giugno, e la lascio seccare al sole per tutta l'estate. Dalle mie prove sembra un buon candidato per la costruzione di ance per strumenti di piccolo calibro interno, 5-6 mm, come per gli obo egizi. È semplice e veloce realizzare un'ancia e la stessa sembra resistere più a lungo di quanto si creda. Anche la stabilità del suono durante la sua insufflazione è accettabile. Voglio farvi ascoltare 2 ance di questa vena fatua in questo breve intervento di Barnaby Brown. Sono inserite nella ricostruzione di un doppio aulos egizio, che potremmo chiamare Ma'id. Proviene dalla tomba di una donna di un certo rango, chiamata Lady Market, trovata alla fine dell'Ottocento a Erlangen in Egitto e ora conservata nel Museo degli Strumenti Musicali di Berlino. Grazie, Barnaby. Pensando invece agli auloi del periodo classico e greco-romano, con calibri interni maggiori, pari a 7,5 e 10 mm, occorre trovare altri tipi di essenze per la costruzione di ance. L'identità botanica per la costruzione di Auleticos calamos è problematica perché la candidata migliore, la Phragmites australis, mostra variazioni genetiche e morfologiche che sfidano i confini di classificazione fra una sottospecie e l'altra. La Phragmites australis ha una concorrente, l'Arundo donax. L'Arundo è il tipo di canna che abbiamo iniziato ad usare nei primi anni delle nostre sperimentazioni, sia perché è ancora oggi impiegata per creare ance per strumenti moderni, sia perché si trova facilmente in commercio già selezionata, essiccata e calibrata per ogni tipo di strumento. Ad ogni modo, nel tempo abbiamo fatto le nostre scorte per i nostri esperimenti, ma sempre tenendo in considerazione Teofrasto ci accorgevamo che forse qualcosa era ancora da capire. La Phragmites ha poca parte legnosa, è delicata e flessibile. Lascia così molto spazio al musicista per decidere come intervenire con la pressione delle labbra o con il diaframma, riuscendo ad ottenere un'innumerevole varietà di effetti. L'Arundo invece è più rigida e legnosa, dunque permette un suono più stabile, ma è meno pronta a regalare modulazioni di cuore. La scelta non è semplice. Come ci anticipò Stelios nella sua tesi di dottorato nel 1994. Io penso che ciò che scrive Teofrasto non è altro che un'intervista fatta ad un ottimo costruttore dei suoi tempi, il quale raccontò ciò che gli era stato insegnato ed aveva appreso dalla sua esperienza e dalla sua tradizione, come accade ancora oggi nelle nostre botteghe artigiane. L'arte si trasmette da maestro ad allievo. Ora, chi ci dice che tutti i costruttori utilizzavano la stessa tecnica e le stesse specie botaniche? Faccio notare che ancora oggi, tra noi più accaniti costruttori di ance, ognuno tenta una propria strada. e immagino che questo sia un bene nell'ottica di auspicabili maggiori scambi di idee. Per avanzare su più fronti possibili, scelta e approvvigionamento del materiale, gestione della stagionatura, metodo di costruzione e controllo delle osservazioni dei costruttori musicisti, Lotos Lab ha pensato di registrare i dati in modo più sistematico, sfruttando la nuova tecnologia per rendere la ricerca sulle canne più semplice e più veloce, per poi pubblicarla a tutti in tempo reale. Affinché i musicisti possano annotare le proprie osservazioni per tutta la durata delle loro ance, si è pensato di marchiare ogni ancia con un codice che deve essere univoco, leggibile e indelebile. Abbiamo scoperto che l'inchiostro permanente svanisce, quindi dal gennaio 2023 stiamo utilizzando un incisore laser per stampare il codice ID. Ad oggi è stato impiegato su 28 giochi teofrastiani, 23 Phragmites, 4 in avena, 1 in arundo, e 30 ance singole, 21 in Phragmites, 8 in avena e 1 in arundo. Un totale di 85 ance per quasi tutti gli strumenti finora ricostruiti. Ecco quindi la necessità di un database online di libero accesso dove saranno inseriti il luogo e la data in cui il materiale è stato raccolto, note sulla stagionatura, il costruttore, il musicista e, per le sole Phragmites, la sezione internodale da cui è stato ricavato. Questo è un dettaglio che evidenziamo anche nel colore del filo utilizzato nella strozzatura fra cannello e parte vibrante. Abbiamo adottato i 7 colori osservati da Erodoto sulle gradinate della zigurat, Ecbatana, dal bianco all'oro, partendo dal basso verso l'alto per la zigurat, così anche per le nostre canne, dalla radice al fiore. Questo database, basato sulla nuova tecnologia Google Sheet, consentirà ai musicisti di registrare le loro osservazioni e gli interventi apportati nel tempo, seguendo la vita di qualsiasi ancia, dal raccolto fino alla sua distruzione, sperando che in un breve futuro questo insieme di dati multiprospettico potrà essere di aiuto a tutti. Veniamo al testo di Teofrasto, pochissimi capitoli della sua Historia Plantarum, dove descrive in poche frasi alcuni passi per noi interessanti. Questo lavoro si sviluppa partendo dagli studi di Barker 84, Stelios 94 e Stefan 2009. Dicono che ci sono 2 tipi di canna, l'auletico, auleticon, e l'altro, heteron. L'altro costituisce un'unica specie internamente differenziata per forza o per debolezza. Se forte e spessa la chiamano canna da palo, se sottile e debole la chiamano canna da tessitura. 2 generi, l'auletico e l'altro. Mi viene da pensare, forse, che l'auletico sia la Phragmites e l'altro sia l'arundo. L'altro, l'arundo, può essere forte e spessa, quindi può essere usata come un paletto per un recinto leggero, o come sostegno per giovani piante, o come bastone d'appoggio, o anche come struttura per costruzione edilizia. È difficile fare pali con la Phragmites, troppo fina e delicata. Se invece rimane sottile, l'altro, può essere sfilettata e usata per intrecciare oggetti di uso domestico. Tutto questo nella cultura contadina avviene ancora oggi con l'arundo, fermo restando comunque il fatto che l'arundo, grazie al suo spessore ligneo, è usata ed è stata sempre usata per la costruzione del bombings, Ciò avviene ancora oggi per alcuni strumenti a fiato ad ancia singola o doppia o anche per flauti diritti e traversi. Cresce ogni volta che c'è abbondanza di pioggia e l'acqua rimane almeno 2 anni. Se rimane più a lungo, cresce meglio. La canna auletica ha bisogno di un perenne contatto con l'acqua. Questa è veramente la base per individuare il canneto appropriato. Ho perlustrato laghi e fiumi e non ho trovato Phragmites lontano da essi. Quelle individuate in piccoli fossi o poco lontane da essi restano piccole e basse, di nessuna utilità. Al contrario, trovo l'arundo ovunque, anche in posti dove non è visibile l'acqua, luoghi che dove ovviamente le radici dimorano in terreni che trattengono l'acqua più a lungo, anche se essa non è visibile in superficie. Esse crescono vigorose e sono molto alte, anche 5 metri, nonostante dimorino fuori dall'acqua. Dicono, a quanto pare, correttamente, che il canneto raggiunga le giuste dimensioni solo quando il lago diventa profondo. Se l'acqua rimane, matura l'anno successivo. Questi accenni all'acqua sono molto ricorrenti in Teofrasto. Io, da costruttore, immagino il costruttore spesso con i piedi in acqua durante la raccolta delle canne, lo vedo districarsi nel cuore del canneto alla ricerca di quelle più lunghe che per natura si allungano cercando la luce. Sceglie quelle senza difetti apparenti, con una buona sezione circolare, il giusto diametro e un lungo internodo. In forma matura diventa canna per giochi, Zeugiten. Mi piace molto la parola giochi. Immagino il gioco che tiene legati 2 buoi così difficili da domesticare per camminare insieme lungo la strada. Le canne dove l'acqua non rimane diventano canne da calamo, per bombix, cioè le canne per costruire la parte dello strumento dove ci sono i fori per le dita. Questa parte è molto interessante e ho potuto verificarla. Vi ho portato oggi esempi di Phragmites australis colta da 3 diversi luoghi. La prima è una canna molto alta, 4 metri, robusta, sempre in acqua, raggiunge abbondantemente i 12 mm di diametro ed ha un buon spessore per la parte legnosa. Produce buone ance anche per labbra allenate, lago di Nemi. La seconda è una canna mediamente alta, prelevata nell'alveo del fiume fra i ciottoli e la sabbia depositata a pochi centimetri dall'acqua corrente. Alcuni momenti dell'anno è inondata, altri è a secco. Raggiunge grandi diametri, 12 mm, ha poco spessore ligneo. Produce ance più leggere. Sono ottime per una auleta principiante, come me. Fiume Calore, Benevento. La terza è la più bassa fra tutte, supera di poco i 2 metri, la raccolgo lungo il perimetro di un piccolo laghetto situato vicino alla mia abitazione, menzionato anche da Plinio il Giovane. Non tutte le canne affondano il corpo nell'acqua, ma il terreno è tale che le sue radici siano sempre immerse. Raggiunge un diametro esterno di 8-9 mm e ha una corteccia molto dura. È perfetta per la riproduzione dei sottili calami egizi. Lago Vadimone, Orte. Tutti questi luoghi sono inclusi nel nostro database con un link GPS che ti porta al punto esatto su Google Maps. In generale dicono che differisce dalle altre specie di canna per la sua forma florida, essendo più voluminosa, più carnosa e nel complesso più femminile nell'aspetto. Sebbene abbia foglie più larghe e più chiare, il suo fiore è più piccolo di quello di altre specie. Anche qui dà delle informazioni morfologiche importanti riguardo la specie. Sottolineare la misura del fiore è un grande aiuto per noi. Possiamo vedere in questa slide i fiori della Phragmites e dell'arundo. La Phragmites ha un pennacchio più corto e tozzo, nel tempo si apre e tende a disporsi come una bandiera. L'arundo ha un pennacchio più lungo e spinato che tende in maturità ad aprirsi a ventaglio. Alcuni steli non hanno nessun fiore, chiamano questi eunuchi. Alcuni sostengono che questi producono i migliori giochi, ma il tasso di successo nel processo di fabbricazione è basso. Non ho ancora investigato al momento, ne ho trovati troppo pochi, non sufficienti per poter fare una produzione di ance tale da trarre conclusioni apprezzabili. Nel prossimo capitolo è descritta la lavorazione. Noi stiamo cercando di seguire passo passo quello che ci viene proposto nei brani seguenti. La lavorazione avviene in questo modo. Una volta raccolte le canne, le pongono all'aria aperta per l'inverno, ancora con le foglie, lemati nella scorza. Poi, in primavera, dopo aver tolto le foglie, ripulito completamente e raschiato via la corteccia, ectripsis, grattare, raschiare, strofinare, consumare, le espongono al sole. In questo video sperimento il momento della raschiatura. È la prima volta che provo questa procedura. Questa attività potrebbe essere valida pensando che il sole possa essiccare direttamente la parte legnosa appena sotto la corteccia asportata. Potrebbero essere così più evidenti i difetti del materiale, come ad esempio venature deteriorate che nel tempo potrebbero generare spaccature, soprattutto sulla parte vibrante dell'ancia. Poi, dopo questi passaggi, in estate, una volta che li hanno tagliati in sezioni internodali, fra le giunture, li mettono di nuovo all'aria aperta per qualche tempo. L'aria calda dell'estate riesce così ad entrare anche all'interno di ogni internodo e togliere l'umidità residua. Ciascun internodo conserva il nodo, goni, giunto, più vicino al fiore, vlasto, germoglio, fiore. La misura di questi non è inferiore a 2 palmi, circa 15 centimetri. Vlastos si riferisce quasi certamente al fiore, al pennacchio, in cima alla canna, ma potrebbe anche significare il bocciolo che si sviluppa sopra ogni nodo, ma non fa alcuna differenza. Il nodo più alto viene mantenuto in entrambi i casi. Nella fase di costruzione del gioco riusciamo a ricordare quale porzione sarà dedicata all'ancia dello strumento con le note acute e quale all'ancia per lo strumento con le note basse. L'ancia per le note acute è quella più vicina al nodo. La misura complessiva del gioco non è inferiore a 2 palmi. Per questo c'è un contributo importante di Stefan nel suo articolo del 2021 sugli aloi antecedenti il periodo greco-romano. Dicono che i migliori internodi per fare il gioco provengano dal centro dell'intera canna. Questa affermazione rispecchia i miei esperimenti. Ad esempio, io ho notato che le ance, che preferisco, derivano spesso dal terzo internodo. Su una media di 6-7 internodi ricavabili sulla lunghezza totale di una canna, ritengo che il terzo, il quarto e il quinto siano i migliori candidati per la costruzione. E poi aggiunge: gli internodi vicino ai fiori fanno i giochi più morbidi e quelli vicino alla radice fanno i giochi più duri. È inevitabile che sia così. Non credo che ci sia altro da aggiungere a questa affermazione. In conclusione, c'è ancora molto lavoro da fare e noi siamo qui per imparare. Con il vostro aiuto possiamo raggiungere una conoscenza più profonda e dare quindi un senso pratico alle parole di Teofrasto attraverso una sintesi rigorosa tra i nostri esperimenti e la filologia classica. Ho bisogno di sentire più voci per non cadere in un autoconvincimento che, come si sa, porta troppo spesso a conclusioni coltivate a lungo nella mia mente, ma per nulla poi aderenti alla realtà dei fatti. Per questo motivo ho lasciato in fondo al testo del mio intervento un'email alla quale potrete inviare, se vorrete, tutte le vostre impressioni al riguardo, anche in un secondo tempo. Vi ringrazio.
Thank you so much, Marco. It was very interesting and very unusual, this approach from the point of view of the instrument maker, and I think that all of us, or at least most of us, we are very interested and also surprised about this consideration you've just done. Maybe we can go to the last paper, in some ways a twin with this paper by Marco, the paper by Barnaby Brown, brief introduction. And Barnaby is a musician, a performer, and he plays the reconstruction of ancient musical instruments by coming from different ages, from the Stone Age to the instruments Roman and Celtic. And he also is a composer. He recorded some piece of music for this label, Delphian Records. And also is a performer, since he, for example, in 2022, he performed this Il Sogno di Marcia, The Dream of Marcia, with the Orchestra della Magna Grecia. It was a composition by Dario Marianelli. And he's also a scholar, since he's carrying out a PhD research at the University of Cambridge on the terminology used by Scottish bagpipe players. So I think that you can start your paper. Thank you.
Let's begin with some Aulos. First of all, thank you. Thank you to the organisers, especially to Eleonora, for organising with such skill a complicated event. It's a real joy, so thank you. Now, this is the Pidna Aulos with some of the reeds that you've just seen with a Lotos Lab catalogue. These reeds are AAAO, and we've already updated the catalogue since the screenshot you saw on Marco. So they're not plus codes, they are ordinary grid references for the location. Now these are fairly new reads, but let's just see what's happening. So I'm going to say that the base holes are open, okay? So I'm adjusting these little lever rings, rotating rings here, so that the base hole is open. I have on each pipe, the low pipe and the high pipe, 5 finger holes and 1 base hole. And the pipes are a finger hole apart in pitch. invite you to hear is that I have options. Now, here's the window of options, or the range. Now, to do that, I pull the reeds out of my mouth and I relax. Okay, so that's what you might call a slack sound, or a low pitch. So if I go that high, this reed is just, closing up and stopping. So that's hits the ceiling, all right? And I like to think of this as a range. There's a comfortable range that's safe, and then as your reeds absorb water, that range increases. And of course, the range you have depends on many, many factors. Depends on the pressure at which you're blowing, it depends on how hard you're compressing with your lips, it depends on where the reeds are placed in your embouchure, it depends on the species of the, far more than just the species, where it was harvested, when it was harvested, and how it was made. So a very confounding number of factors. But the point I want to make is that it doesn't matter. You will always have a pitch window, because that is built into the design of this wide bore instrument. If you want to reduce that bendiness inherent in the instrument design, you must create a narrow bore instrument, and that reduces your pitch window. And you can minimize the window by going to thick reeds that are inflexible and don't respond to changes in embouchure to the same degree as these. But as you've seen, if Phragmites is the right material, then it's generally quite thin, particularly in the middle of the cane. So, I've easily got a semitone of range. Now, that is, in terms of testing, that is not very scientific. We need to put it into context, because they didn't play single notes, they played music. So I'll give you a very little brief pitch test. A little ditty. And I would note during that test, I'm not looking at the meter, okay? I don't want to be influenced by what I'm seeing. I'm trying to use the techniques of the period here. And I'm noticing, well, on that fifth, I have to push in a little bit on the high pipe, okay? Starting with that fingering. I'll now go down a tone. There we go. I should have asked somebody to write these down. Okay, what pitch am I actually playing at? I'm intentionally not looking. Okay? I'm being guided by the instrument. So let's just recap. Would somebody like to write these down for me, please? We've got the first one, okay, number 3. minus 30. And I'm doing exactly the same fingering on my low pipe as I was doing on the high pipe, okay? So it's just one tone lower, one auletic tone lower. B flat 3 plus 30, or plus 27, okay? Last one. A flat 2 minus A, okay? Plus or minus 20, okay? Now, I'm going to close the bass holes. Because that's the only way you can get an octave on this instrument. Just, straight into the mouth. What, that F sharp. What was that? Round about A440, F sharp, okay? Now, I can obviously do it at semitone platter. No, I can't. Okay, so I've got a semitone, and as these reeds open up, they warm up, I might be able to get a tone lower. Let's see. So I get an F sharp plus 44. I can get an F2 minus 38. Okay, so that gives me pretty well a whole tone of pitched range, depending on whether I want to go sweet and fine with my tone, or harsh and bright and brash. Okay, so the flatter I go. Now, this is all in my ear. Okay, so I'm adjusting. I've tuned these. I would really like to say that all this work is built on the foundation of what Stefan's done. Okay, so he gives a fabulously strong foundation, and what I'm doing is now I'm sort of building on that, checking in, asking new questions that emerge from a different perspective. The first thing that I found really helpful is what you tune. Okay, is it the fifth or is it the fourth? Now, as you may be aware, the holes here are pretty equal. Okay, so there's a very important study that Stefan published in 2000, the Understanding Early Alloy, where you can see lined up. Sorry, I've got it to show you, but it's well worth looking at those diagrams where Stefan lines up all the pipes, and you can see different hypotheses measured up one against the other. Okay. Now, what I have found works for me as a player, just investigating over the last 5 years what this can do. Here we are where you have the octave available. You need to tune the soul and be able to do a pure fifth or a pure fourth. Two different fingerings for the same pitch. change the colour, the timbre of the note, by achieving it with a different fingering. With the higher fingering, I have to pull out. With the lower fingering, I push in to achieve the same pitch. Professor of early medieval music at Cambridge, Sam Barrett, writing in a blog. He published a wonderful article here, but his blog states it so clearly. We have texts that we know were sung. We know the biggest instruments were used. We know the instrumentalists were virtuosos whose playing enthralled audiences. To insist on reading these texts without singing them and on performing them without instruments is not to retreat into the safety of the known, but to experience them in a way that goes against surviving evidence. Now, this is in the context of early medieval music. In fact, it's his work with sequencia. So I'll just jump to another influential thing on my approach, which will bring me to the topic of our conference. This is John Cole's 1973, okay? Archaeology by experiment. And I think it's rather good to come back to, founding father of this discipline. Because I am delighted to collaborate with somebody like Marco, because he is a modern technician who's not incompetent, inexperienced, or inexpert as regards 1 and 2 above. Okay? In other words, using the materials and the techniques of the time, place, and activity under investigation. And, the whole list of them. Parameters, qualifications, and limits clearly formulated. This is all should be familiar stuff. We should come back to this regularly, I suggest. I published a few years ago a very heretical experiment here, if you're not aware of it. And this is my first experimentation with new technology using a font, designing a font in order to create these symbols here, which were my way of beginning to try to put onto paper what I was experiencing as a practitioner. Okay, so this is coming at it not from the later written evidence, Alypius and Aristoxenus. This predates Aristoxenus by a century. Okay, so I'm trying to come at this from the experience of the player using the times, techniques, and tools of the period. And I was quite interested in using, just to explain, the idea here is, and I explain this down here, I'm using 3 colours, gold, grey, and bronze, to indicate how differently you might deliver a pitch. Okay? So this is all very problematic. Okay, I totally accept that. But it's me attempting to bring a different perspective to, let's say, be looking at the same evidence, the same old evidence, with new tools and with human intelligences that gather a more holistic array of sensory intelligence, which includes touch, what I'm experiencing with my lips, and sound, what we're hearing with our ears. But to cut very quickly, so for example, why am I presenting? So this is me processing the results published by Christos and Stefan. Beginning, this is years maybe from publication, but just to show you me thinking about the Megara Aulos in another way, the player perspective. What does it feel like? And if we consider what I'd like to just point out here, if we can, the idea, I suppose, if we look at Aristophanes with an eye to the boring finger holes of Aulos, you know, we all know this, 3D ACs from one another. Well, how does that arrive on paper in the generation before Aristophanes? Now, they didn't have the meter that I had up there. How did they arrive? What I would have liked to have done for this presentation is have a whole array of 28 or 24 pitch pipes, you know, so that I could play my thing and you could come up and test it using a tool and technique of the period. And I think when we start applying that approach, we'll get different insights. And I think I'm not arguing for not using modern technology, not at all. Don't get me wrong. I'm saying that we must do everything in our power not to be fooled into believing something that isn't true, or into thinking something is not true that is. And that, I think, means using both modern technology and the tools, techniques of the period in conjunction, and going backwards and forwards, refining our beliefs, and in being very humble and ready to change our hypotheses. Because the Megara does not have any mechanisms for the finger holes. And my heretical point here, advanced as a hypothesis, is that the Megara Aulos is not a modulating instrument. Aulos is a modulating instrument and always was. It is inherently the modulating instrument, and that changes how we read our texts, and it changes some of our long-held beliefs. And the reason I say that, perhaps again, is because when ancient astronomers were looking at the stars, they didn't get it right first time. It's a complex phenomenon they're observing. And I'd like to suggest that ancient musicologists were exactly the same. They did the best job they could, but they didn't necessarily get it right. And so when they're measuring 3D ACs or 4D ACs between Phrygian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, what I demonstrated at the beginning of this presentation might be what they were measuring with their old technology. I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barnaby. Maybe this presentation aroused some question. Any question? Camila.
How do you mean that Aulos was always modulating instrument?
Well, I suppose my argument there is that when Plato banishes the Aulos, he's not banishing a modern instrument. He's banishing the traditional instrument. And I'm suggesting that what I'm holding here is a teleos Aulos, I suppose. This is the hypothesis. And that the Megara is a hupe teleos Aulos that enables you to use levers to change the configuration of base holes. But actually what's going on in the formation of the Aulos player is built on a long lineage. And that's what Plato is invoking, this longer lineage, and also that it's more the lyre players who are imitating Aulos. So the act of modulation, I would put more in the early 5th century and late 6th century, the capacity to do what I demonstrated at the beginning, to play in 3 different keys. Actually, I would put that back to the early 6th century. So I'm maybe talking about modulation in a different way.
Than the sources.
No, I'm just purely talking about what I can do on material evidence of the period. So I'm not thinking about notation, because that notation is evolved 200 years after this instrument design is established. And then seeking to square Aristoxenus's attempt to let's say, the harmonicoid's attempt to measure the distance between auletic toni. So I'm not actually getting as far as Aristoxenus.
So actually you are defining modulation in a different way than the ancients did.
Well, careful what they is. I'm talking about the they that predates maybe 430. So it's those ideas. And the thing is that they're invisible, and writing is a technology, and so when I call this paper Technophilia, we are drawn towards writing, and I'd like to say, well, actually, writing is not more valuable evidence than the alloy themselves, and we need to I would like to campaign for the recognition of this data, this evidence, as of a quality that challenges what we understand from the literary evidence, and we need to give it more weight.
Any other questions? Stefan.
Yeah, just to be perfectly clear, you say reading the texts in the light of new evidence, but this also means reading such a text that tells us Pronomos was the first to perform three harmonia on a single instrument, that this, you wouldn't read this in a new light, you would just say it's wrong, which it may perfectly be, so it is a late information and it may be wrong, that must be conceded. But in this case, it's dismissing a bit of spurious evidence.
Well, I wouldn't say it's spurious. I think we need to, that's a very important, thank you for bringing that up, that needs to be addressed, as do various other literary sources. So I would weigh that up together with Lassus's point and the followers of Epigonus's point that Aulos pitches had breadth.
Pitches, no, not Aulos pitches has breadth.
Pitches.
Yeah, which is a totally different thing. That includes lyre pitches.
The later comment about there being every note, every whole from Aulos and Zeronia producing at least 3 notes. So there's a lot of literary evidence, and I would say that it all needs to be, the synthesis of all this evidence is complex.
James Lloyd.
Thank you so much. And I kind of sit somewhere between your approach, I think, in that I think what you've done before with the Poseidonia Aulos and demonstrating the possibility to kind of modulate between, correct me if I'm wrong, like Dorian and Mixolydian and things like that on the Poseidonia, because of the flexibility of what a performer can bring to a pipe, is really interesting for helping us think about the possibilities that we have in earlier periods, and particularly thinking about the difficulties of what this trimeles nomos is or isn't. But returning to the archaeology, there is a definite development in the complexity of alloy that we have from the earlier periods, where we have finds of multiple bore sizes, multiple hole sizes. Presumably that's not necessarily just pitch and scales or modes that are being changed, but other features such as more general qualities of sound. So the question I have is, the developments of sliders and rotating sleeves a response to prior practice to make it easier? Or is it a technology that allows new ways of performing, which I think is what traditionally would be held, I suppose?
I suppose a quick answer is, living today, there are 2 flute traditions. One in Turkey and most of the Middle East, where they create all the different makam by lip bending. Okay, various, all range of lip bending and finger bending in combination. Okay, so whole range of extremely complex macam, and there's a lot of training involved, and they do it wonderfully well when they're well trained. They don't have any technical engineering, fine and precision engineering on their name. They just have equidistant holes. And so it was that expertise that made me think this way, okay, a living tradition. And at the same time, we have flute players who have fancy keywork that enables them to do what the ney players do on the list. So both are possible.
Yeah. I just another thought. Have you considered also, I forget which papyrus it is, but perhaps Beryl something or other, the contract of this person, someone's slave being taken out to the Aulos tutor, and it gets them playing 7 different kinds of auloi. For my mind, I read that as seeing different auloi in this case are being used for different kinds of performance. So, I mean, again, it's very tricky because, you know, so little survives, but...
Well, I think it's important to really focus on what does survive. And we have Aristoteles telling us there are 5 sorts of auloi. And he doesn't call them Dorian, Phrygian, Mixolydian, Median. He calls them Pyrikos, Partenaios, Teleios, Hyperteleios, and Kypheristeos. So we've got that is one of the bits of evidence that we have to face, together with the very much later story about Pronomos. You know, what is it that Pronomos invented? I don't doubt that Pronomos invented something, but I do question the literal accuracy of that tradition.
We don't have the context of Aristotle because there we only have the notations. So there is 3 types of music: diatonic, chromatic, and enharmonic. But all this comes in Dorian or Phrygian. So if you got only one statement and you take it out of context, you may get a very reduced classification.
Maybe there is another question, maybe the last one.
I will be short, thank you. I was just a little remark about the musical notation, because you were creating notations. I was thinking about that, but do you think that it's possible to imagine that the origin of the music, the instrumental notation, with always these triads of signs, one which is straight and 2 which are derived from the straight one, could have something to do with the modulation you do just with moving the instrument without changing your fingers?
Okay, let me just...
it's just an hypothesis that it could be an origin of that, because, yeah, of course you use these signs, I could see that. But
okay, so, I mean, the reason that I started exploring this was because I was in a teaching situation and I had to explain to students how to pitch something, and so I started trying to write it down, and I found myself having to notate on paper the reed placement. And in other words, I was in the same ancient context. It was, I realized that the penny dropped. What I'm doing here, because I've got students, I'm trying to transmit something that I've learned to a student. I want to write it down. I wonder how they, when they face that problem without any notation behind them, how do they do it? And the logical thing to do is to do a tablature. You have a sign that represents a finger, and if it's the same finger, you have different ways of inflecting that finger. So you have a symbol, and you inflect it one way or the other. To me, it's a fairly straightforward conclusion that it originates. I'm not talking about the late development of the notation system, but at its very birth, it makes sense to me that it could be a tablature representing a symbol for a finger, and then a symbol for whether you're flattening or raising.
Yes, thank you.